And now to turn our attention to this evening, please join me in welcoming the Honourable Chrystia Freeland, Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mark Thompson, the President and CEO of the New York Times Company, and Peter Baker, Chief White House Correspondent for the New York Times.
Well, perhaps I can just begin by saying that Peter and I were reflecting a moment ago. There aren't many countries in the world you can go to a public event to be told the foreign minister has arrived by cycling through the snow. There's something unique, and I have to say, I think incredibly precious about that. So hang on to it. Something else to say about Chrystia Freeland is, I think you became Minister for Foreign Affairs a few days before the inauguration of Donald Trump. There aren't many of your predecessors, I'm guessing, who've had quite as large and groaning intrays as you've had in your time, and including a certain kind of event into which Canada seems to be placed, not, as it were, through its own choosing. And I guess we better begin with today. The news of a former Canadian diplomat, Michael Kovrig, being arrested in China in what many people are saying may be retaliation for the arrest in this country on behalf of the US law enforcement authorities of the Chinese company Huawei's CFO. She was in court again, I think, again today. Could you just tell us what your government's understanding is of the current situation and what you're going to do about it?
You're really starting soft, Mark. I like that.
I did the bit about the bicycle too.
Okay, thank you. No, so look, all laughing aside, when it comes to consular cases, and speaking as Canadian foreign ministers, particularly of Canadians detained abroad, what we have first and foremost in mind is that these are people. These are our compatriots, and we have a tremendously important duty of care that we take really seriously. We've been in touch with Mr. Kovrig's family, and we have raised the issue with the Chinese authorities. When it comes to the case of, as we do always, and I want to say, especially if his family members are hearing us tonight, this has our attention at the very highest levels of our government. We're very, very focused on it, and know that we are concerned. When it comes to the case of Ms. Meng, I think it's really important to be clear that Canada is a rule of law country, and Canada is a country that believes in abiding by its treaty obligations. In the case of Ms. Meng, all due process, all Canadian due process has been followed to this point. This is a situation where there has been no political interference at all. This has been purely a case of abiding by treaty obligations. At this point, as you mentioned, Mark, her case is before the courts. We have been very clear with China that she has been convicted of breaking no laws. She absolutely ought to have Chinese officials have full consular access to her. We need to treat her in a respectful way, and that is what we are seeking to do. And at this stage, the case is before the courts and is being handled by Canadian judges in accordance with the law. And that's how it has to be. And, I am sure everyone appreciates here, and I certainly appreciate also the geopolitical complexity potentially radiating from all of this. But being a rule of law country is core to who we are as a country. And being a rule of law country, you can't, it's not like going to a buffet. You can't sort of say, I follow rule of law for these two dishes because I really like them, but this one I don't like so much, so we're not going to be rule of law in this matter. At this point, the case is before Canadian judges. I've spot in the audience Tom Heinzman, one of Canada's most distinguished lawyers. And I think Tom, he really is. And I think Tom will agree with me that our independent legal system is one of the finest, if not the finest, in the world. I trust it. Canadians should trust it. And our partners around the world should trust it too.
Ms. Freeland, you said you're concerned, obviously, about Michael Kovrig, and you're in touch with the Chinese government about his case. But you didn't say whether or not you think it's related. Are these two things related?
That's right, that I didn't say that.
Yes. We noticed. Have you had any indications from the Chinese government that they're related?
We are treating Mr. Kovrig's case really seriously. He is a Canadian who has been detained, and we're very focused on it. We've raised it with the Chinese authorities, and we're in touch with his family.
Okay. What other pressure has the Chinese government tried to put on Canada since Ms. Meng's arrest? They called your ambassador in. There's a lot of trade between Canada and China. It's a big, important thing to Canada. What are the potential ramifications of this?
I think, Peter, that's really a question for China. What is important for us to communicate to China and also to Canadians is what I've just said, that this case, the detention of Ms. Meng, is not a political judgment by Canada. This is about Canada abiding by an extradition treaty with no political interference at all.
Are you told about this arrest before it happens, or does it happen automatically without your knowledge?
The Prime Minister has said that he was informed that it would happen. And in accordance with our processes, there was no interference. We believe very strongly in following our treaty commitments and in not interfering politically. There's a real slippery slope there that you can slide down incredibly quickly. And, both Mark and Merrick referred at the beginning to this being a pretty complicated time in the world. We're seeing a lot of countries around the world that are starting to play fast and loose with democratic institutions and with rule of law. Canada is not going to be one of those countries, and it's not always so easy to be a rule of law country, but in the fullness of time, we're always going to be glad that we stick to that. And I just want to say, we agree with that, right? And I'm going to say just one more thing to Peter's question. It's important for us, and we're working on this, to be sure that this reality of what has happened is fully explained by us to China. And I do want to take this opportunity to say that Canada's relationship with China is important. It's a relationship that we value. It's a relationship that can and will and must continue.
You said there are countries around the world that are showing some signs of playing fast and loose with rule of law systems, and they may or may not be as committed to rule of law as they had once been. Do you include the United States in that list?
You know what? Actually, I think that one of the things that a lot of people have commented on, including many New York Times reporters and commentators, is the incredible resilience of U.S. institutions, very much including the rule of law and the judiciary. And I think Canadians, we're right next door to you guys. We have the world's longest unmilitarized border. Quite a few of us read the New York Times, in fact. Yeah. Canadians are well aware of the working of the U.S. judiciary and, frankly, some of the really, really admirable ways that the U.S. judiciary has operated. Now, I think the Canadian judiciary is the very, very best, of course, but...
Just before, I'm sure we're going to spend much of this conversation talking about US-Canada relations. Just before then, this broader point about countries which are playing fast and loose. There was an instance in the summer where you did something which a few years ago would have been regarded as being unremarkable. You I think, tweeted or certainly let it be known that you and the Canadian government
It was a tweet. I know what you're talking about.
Were anxious about the treatment of some women's rights advocates in Saudi Arabia. And the response of the Saudi Arabian government was very aggressive to that tweet. And I suppose my question really is, do you have to think carefully? I mean, if, as you say, Canada, in a sense, is playing by old rules, or traditional rules, tried and tested rules, you might well argue, but there are other countries there which, for whatever reason, have decided to throw away that rule book in ways which potentially could be damaging to Canada. Do you and your colleagues have to think carefully about language and about tactics, given how different the climate is out there now?
Yeah, that is an excellent question, Mark. And of course, we have to think really carefully about language and tactics, always. And I hope that Canadian ministers of the Crown, always have done that. But you're right that we're living in a fraught time, and in a time when some certainties are not so certain anymore. You know, my favorite book at the moment is, and I think I'm going to give you a New York Times another plug. I think I saw this reviewed in the New York Times book review a couple of weeks ago, is the new Robert Kagan book, The Jungle Grows Back. And, you know, the basic argument he makes is that the post-war rules-based international order and domestic liberal democracies are not the resting natural state of the world, and that they are not also kind of the natural, you know, state to which we are all inevitably, as humans and as human societies and as a world community, progressing. But what he argues instead is that this was quite a deliberate, quite a conscious effort to construct something in the post-war period led by the United States. If I had been Bob's editor, I would have said, you should point out more the role Canada played in building this order, because we were there at the creation. But his core point is, with the Jungle Grows Back point, is you know, that this post-war order, it's like a garden. You know, my dad's a farmer, so I would say it's like a farm. And if you don't weed it all the time, if you don't seed your crops every spring, if you don't fertilize them, if you don't weed them as a gardener or spray them as a farmer, and if you don't harvest them, you're not going to have a garden anymore. So to your point, I wouldn't say it's old-fashioned rules that we believe in. It's actually the liberal democracy that we're lucky enough to have now. And I think as Canadians, we are very conscious that we are very lucky. I would argue, and I don't think that this is gloating at all, I think Canada is the strongest liberal democracy in the world right now. And if you guys disagree with me, name me one that's stronger. Right? Truly. Like, we're standing pretty strong, and that's great. It means we have to pay a lot of attention to weeding our garden at home, because we are not under any illusions, you know, as a government, and I'm going to speak for Canadians here. I think we know we're not immune to the disruptive forces other liberal democracies are facing. And you're right, Mark. Like, being the strongest liberal democracy in the world, it can put you in some awkward circumstances in the rest of the world. But I think we need to be proud of who we are and stand up for who we are, and frankly, help people who are living in darker places right now. You guys are clapping too much. It's going to make the reporters mad and ask meaner questions.
No. You say that Canada is the strongest liberal democracy in the world right now, and this is a fascinating week, actually, to have that conversation, because if you look at Europe, of course, we've got Theresa May struggling with Brexit, possibly on the edge of...
I think we have to question Mark about that.
We should question Mark about that, but we've got President Macron, obviously, in retreat with the yellow vests, and Angela Merkel now has anointed a like-minded successor, but she's on her way out.
She had to win a contest.
She had to win a contest.
In the CDU.
Yes.
AKK. She wasn't anointed. She was
you're right.
Merkel.